I am absolutely convinced that this government wants to create a surveillance state in the United Kingdom. Now, whilst I can see why they might want to do that, it's for safety, it's for security, it's for monitoring illicit activity that would threaten the United Kingdom and its citizens and so on and so forth, we cannot escape the fact that this is not what the British people want. Now, why do I say that I'm convinced of this? Because there are a number of things going on, and one of which is, of course, the push for digital ID, which on the face of it would give them access to all sorts of information on every single adult in the United Kingdom. And now recent reports say they want to do it for as young as 13 years old. But also, you'll recall that earlier in the year, they reportedly issued a technical capability notice to Apple because Apple has a robust security feature which encrypts all of the user data and prevents anybody from accessing it. Now, they wanted a backdoor into this secured data, and Apple, frankly, said no, they would rather switch it off than create a backdoor into its secure storage. Now, there was also a huge backlash from Donald Trump and his entire administration because that would obviously encompass American citizens who are resident or otherwise present in the United Kingdom. So this was a huge backlash because, quite obviously, pretty much everybody said we don't want the UK government to have access to everybody's private stored information, which would include all your messages, all your photographs, all your files, all your storage, everything. So they then withdrew it. They abandoned the plans earlier in the year. So not before this demand by the UK government had sparked diplomatic clash between the UK and the US and almost derailed efforts to secure a trade agreement, the UK government withdrew and backed down on that demand. However, it's now reportedly been revised, so I'll link an article from the Financial Times in the description below, which says that despite having given up on this previous technical capability notice, this TCN, the UK government has now revived its demand to Apple to allow access to its encrypted data, but only for British users, and expressly said that it only applied to British citizens' data, according to people briefed on the matter as reported in the Financial Times. Now, predictably, the Home Office response to this is that we do not comment on operational matters, including, for example, confirming or denying the existence of any such notices. They say, we will always take actions necessary at the domestic level to keep the UK citizens safe. Although it should be said that both Apple and the Home Office are restricted from discussing the contents and the details of any technical capability notice by law. But it didn't stop Apple from commenting generally. Apple said Apple is still unable to offer advanced data protection in the UK to new users. We are gravely disappointed that the protections provided by ADP are not available to our customers in the UK, given the continuing rise of data breaches and other threats to customer privacy. It also said that as we've said many times before, we have never built a backdoor or master key to any of our products or services and never will. But here's the thing, it's not even as simple as that, because if the UK government, as it insists, is only looking at British users' data on this secure cloud server for which they want a backdoor into, even if Apple did concede and create such a backdoor or master key or anything else which they deny, in my view, it is going to be practically impossible to exclude anyone who is just visiting the UK or just happens to be in the UK as against a British citizen who is permanently resident here and so on. I think that is practically impossible to achieve, and not least of which because the mechanisms and the security features and the way that the Apple system works, if there were any kind of backdoor, any kind of master key, any kind of way around it whatsoever, this would invariably be exploited by hackers and bad actors to access data across the globe, not just within the UK and not just about British citizens. This would be about people worldwide in the Apple ecosphere. And just as the legal director for Privacy International, Caroline Palo, said, if Apple did break end-to-end encryption for the UK, it breaks it for everyone. The resulting vulnerability can be exploited by hostile states, criminals, and other bad actors the world over. And I would add that that would apply to all data stored across the Apple ecosphere worldwide, not just in the UK because of the way the system works. And she says that this new order might be just as big a threat worldwide to privacy and security as the old one, as in the original order that wanted access to all data in the UK, regardless of whether they're British citizens or not. Now, this hasn't gone unnoticed, and the original request didn't go unnoticed. Now, key figures reportedly in Donald Trump's administration, including J.D. Vance and the Director of National Intelligence, had put pressure on the UK for the original TCN, and the case was due to be heard next year, but then obviously was abandoned later on. But having revived this now, it puts additional pressure back between the UK and the US. And again from the FT, a person close to the Trump administration said at the time that the request for Apple to break its encryption would have to be dropped altogether to remain faithful to the agreement between the two countries. Any backdoor would weaken protection for US citizens. And again, I would add, regardless of whether the UK intends to target UK citizens or not. And let's not forget that it was only about a month ago when the UK hosted President Trump for a state visit, during which it was agreed that US companies would invest billions of dollars to build AI infrastructure in Britain. Doubtless that will come under scrutiny if they really press for the release of this backdoor by Apple. Members of the US delegation raised the issue of the request for Apple around the time of Trump's visit, according to the FT, according to two people who were briefed on the matter. And according to the FT, two senior British government officials claimed that the US administration was no longer leaning on the UK government to rescind this order. But with great respect, I doubt it, because if it comes to US citizens' data and protection and privacy, even if the UK insists that it's only looking into British citizens' data, like I say, I find that implausible, impractical, and probably impossible. I'm sure some data specialists will be able to tell me in the comments, but from my knowledge of the way those system works, any exploit of any kind of any part of the system is an exploit for the entire system and all of the data therein. And with the number of data leaks and hacks and breaches that we've had in recent years, I reiterate that it's a question of when rather than if these things are broken. So with Apple to have an extreme encryption on its devices, that is obviously full end-to-end encryption is designed to prevent other people gaining access. Now, on the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, I can see the business case for why the UK and the security services would want access to all of the data so they could watch people on certain lists and look out for bad actors, nefarious intent, and would-be terrorists and foil their plots and so on. And I wholeheartedly support that effort, but it does have to be balanced against the rights and the privacy of every other individual in the UK. And I suppose there'll be a lot of people, let me know in the comments, but I think there'll be a lot of people that say, well, I've got nothing to hide, so why not just let them access the data? But let's run through, firstly, what the data is, and then why I think it might be a problem, because there are ways that this might be a problem that you can't even imagine just yet. Now, the data would encompass everything from your messages, your emails, both in and out, any photographs you've taken, where you've taken those photographs, all of your file storage and everything that's in those files, whether it's, again, to or from, whether it's created by you or not. Some material, by the way, is terrorist material, and if you have it in your possession, you're guilty of a terrorism offence, even if you've just unwittingly downloaded something. Some people are caught up in that. Now, imagine for a moment that the government has access to all of that, along with, for good measure, GPS data, where you've been, where you're going, where you are, etc., even down to your heart rate and your health stats if they are picked up by your watch. Now, again, many people might think that's perfectly fine, you've got nothing to hide. However, I have several stories of my own from prospective clients, and there are countless stories like this where people are caught up innocently, but the result is quite damaging. Now, just a few weeks ago, I had an email from a prospective client who had, let's just say they'd taken a video at a school play of sorts, and it was seemingly perfectly innocent, but they'd shared it with other parents. Now, that created what we would refer to as a false flag, because of the nature of the video, the systems had flagged it, said this might be problematic. The response from the company was just to terminate all access to all emails, all photographs, all files, everything, the whole lot. Now, because this person relied on those systems for pretty much everything, everything was wiped off. Access to everything, all photographs, all files, all emails, everything was wiped off in an instant. And it was still, by all accounts, a false flag, because from what we know, it was just a play. Nothing particularly nefarious about that, and just shared it with a few families. Now, if, for example, the government had access to every single message, every single email, every single file, every single photograph, picture the most horrendous argument you've had with somebody, and you've said something that you think you shouldn't have said on reflection, and you've ended up apologizing for it, whatever. There could be all sorts of different reasons and all sorts of different material that may create a false flag. They might create a real flag for which you may never have been caught up in before. And again, many people might think that that's right. If you've got illicit material, you should be caught up for it. But this would potentially open such a Pandora's box that everybody would be at risk to both real and false flags. And this could cause devastation across people's lives. And this, I suggest, is what you're balancing when you consider whether the government should have access to all this data in order to track who they would be believed to be criminals. Now, we can say that we would trust them to do that and trust them only to target would-be criminals, would-be terrorists, and those who are on a list and really would be nefarious and so on. But take my word for it, the systems already do flag for certain things, and they already cause people serious problems, and that is without the government having access to it. But now, coming full circle to the beginning of the video, why I said this is creating a surveillance state, whether that's the intention or not, I think that's the result if they do push all of these things through. Picture that together with your digital ID, which Keir Starmer is insisting on rolling out to every adult, even as I read down to 13-year-olds, which I think is a bit of a strange breach in and of itself, but there we are. But if they do roll this out to every individual, and they also have access to all of your messages, all of your emails, all of your photos, all of your files, they quite literally have a blueprint on every single person coming down to a single digital alphanumeric ID of sorts. That, in my view, is a surveillance state. And if they can track where you are, where you're going, everything you've done, they might soon have AI, let's say, because of the development of AI infrastructure, they may soon have AI trawling through this stuff and create a blueprinted attack upon you in one way or another, whether that's criminal investigation or any other kind of investigation, if they have access to all of your data. That is the warning. And I think if there are cybersecurity specialists watching, you can comment below and let people know your thoughts on that. But from my knowledge of it and my experience as a lawyer, having had clients come to us with these problems where they've had these flags raised, whether they're right or not, sometimes people are innocently caught up in wrongdoing, but it's wrongdoing nonetheless, and they have to deal with it. And some people are caught up by a false flag, which is where there isn't any wrongdoing, but they are treated as such because, just like banks and organizations, they take the cautious approach and they just shut things down. One of the criticisms and complaints people have had with banks is where their account has just been shut down. They've been locked out and shut down because the bank takes a cautious approach. Now, if people have a large amount of cash transactions in and out, the bank might suspect it of money laundering. Therefore, the bank might just shut you down and give you 48 hours to move your money elsewhere. That's happened. We've had clients who that has happened to, and they've had all of these problems having to sort this thing out, find a new bank. And then, of course, when they want to find a new bank, they say, why are you moving from your old bank? And they've said, well, it's been closed down. They say, why? And then the new banks refuse to take them because some other bank has shut them down. One client, who was the most unfortunate, ended up on the CIFAS fraud database because they sold an item for which they were paid a cash transaction into their bank account, which was flagged as fraud, and therefore they ended up on the fraud database. Therefore, they couldn't get so much as a mobile phone contract or a credit card, much less a bank account or anything else. It seriously turned their life upside down. And even as a lawyer, when I wrote to the bank, they just ignored it because their requirements and their small print and the laws that they can hide behind allow them to do so. Now, picture all of that and just picture any one message or photograph or file or something else that somebody might take the wrong way with a false flag and then turn your life upside down. The best you might hope for is they restrict access and delete all of your services. And that is perhaps the least disruption you might expect if there's a false or even a real flag against something in your storage. So with all that in mind, with digital ID, when it comes to the time, if we are asked to vote on it, some kind of referendum, or you're asked your view, think about that the next time you think about digital ID. Leave me your thoughts and comments below. And of course, thank you for watching.